Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Professor Payne, and today we're going to be talking about a period in American music history called the Jazz Age, which lasted from 1920 to approximately 1930. And this period is also called the Roaring Twenties because it was quite a tumultuous period of time, and a lot of really interesting things happened. When talking about this period in American history, it's important to talk about first the idea of prohibition, which was a nationwide constitutional ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages from 1920 until 1933. And it's important to note that during this period, these laws were, widely disregarded. Literally millions of dollars of tax revenues were lost, and this also led to organized crime and organized criminal gangs, which basically took control of the sale and distribution of alcohol throughout the United States, and released a quite incredible crime wave that affected everyone across the nation. By the late 1920s, a new opposition kind of mobilized throughout the United States, and these people were referred to as the Wets, and they attacked prohibition as causing crime, lowering local revenues, imposing rural Protestant religious values on urban America, and just being prohibition just being a terrible law, which I think it really was. It was originally set into motion by these religious communities, which were kind of fighting against the ill effects of alcoholism in the United States. Women at this period of time, didn't have a whole lot of rights, and they were typically the job of the average woman in the United States was to take care of her family and have kids and whatnot, and the men's job was to go out and make money. And there was tons of cases where these husbands were spending all their money on alcohol, and as a result, the women and the children were left in poverty and starving to death, and it was a huge mess. And as a result, the American government instituted this idea of prohibition to try and fix these issues. But as a result, it actually just created a lot more issues, like as we'll talk about more in a little bit. But prohibition ended up ending in 1933 on December 5th with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment. And some states actually continued statewide prohibition, marking the last stages of the progressive era and progressive politics in the United States. And this prohibition really was taken advantage of by these gangsters such as Al Capone, who actually ended up earning as much as $60 million during this period of time. He was actually one of the wealthiest men in America, if not the most wealthy person in America during this period. He made a ton of money, and he was essentially just a criminal and a thug who he was involved not only in the sale of alcohol and distribution, but also in illegal gambling and prostitution and racketeering and tons of crimes and murders across the country. But actually, as a result of this prohibition era and illegal alcohol being illegal, these nightclubs started popping up all over the country called speakeasies. And speakeasies were important in that they were these kind of illegal, illicit bars that were kind of hidden in plain sight. And these are where people would go to hang out and drink alcohol and listen to music. And actually, this is where a lot of jazz ended up popping up. And these speakeasies, the owners of which ended up employing a lot of jazz musicians, and it was an interesting place, these speakeasies, in that they weren't segregated, which the rest of the country predominantly was segregated at this point. So all races and all religions and all sexes were allowed in these bars, these speakeasies, black and white people and men and women, and they were just allowed to get together and have a good time, and they didn't have to worry about really racism and prejudice and these different kinds of things, and everyone would just get together and listen to jazz and have a good time. And actually, most often there weren't a whole lot of problems that really popped up in these speakeasies. Another thing to talk about during this period in the 1920s is that jazz actually started to disseminate across the entire world, particularly to Europe and also to South America. If you remember from the last lecture, we were talking about the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which was the first jazz ensemble to record this art form in 1917. The next year, in 1918, they actually undertook a tour of Europe and established a residency actually for a little over a year in England, where they played shows almost on a nightly basis, and they traveled all throughout Europe performing this music and really basically popularizing it in many ways. And a lot of musicians actually followed the lead of the original Dixieland Jazz Band and started to go on tour in Europe and try and make some money. Guys like Benny Payton and Arthur Briggs and Sidney Bechet, who we talked about last week, they all did tours with their own jazz groups in Europe, and it really helps the art form get popular in other parts of the world, and musicians in Europe started to pop up and play this music and really help the art form evolve. Also, at the same time, American jazz reached new listeners not only in Europe but also in South America. So, there was jazz being played and listened to and performed in Germany, in England, in Hungary, in Belgium, and even in South American countries like Brazil. So it was quite an incredible thing. People were starting to realize how awesome this music really was, and how great of a musical genre that jazz was continuing to be and evolving into. Also, various composers of the Western classical tradition started to adopt elements of jazz in their own compositions. For example, the French composer Darius Milhaud wrote a composition called Les Créations du Monde in 1923, which actually incorporated elements of jazz into the Western classical genre. Another example of this was by the the Austrian composer Ernst Krenek, and he actually wrote an opera in German called Johnny spielt auf, which means Johnny plays in German. He wrote this in 1925, and in this opera, it's in German, and the music and the lyrics of the opera are about a jazz violinist. So it took some elements to, jazz was a new hip thing all around the world, and people from all over the place were trying to incorporate elements and kind of talk about this new style of music that was coming into vogue. Also, it's important to talk about how the public was reacting to jazz during this period, especially in the United States, and there was actually mixed reviews of this art form. So, if you remember from the last lecture, we were talking about military marches and this sort of thing. One of the most famous composers of these military marches around the turn of the century was a composer named John Philip Sousa, and he was actually employed by the United States Marine Corps, and he led the Marine Corps band for many years. But in his opinion, he said that jazz excites the baser instincts in man. So he really didn't like jazz. There was a New York Times article actually written in 1924 that stated that jazz offends people with musical tastes that are already formed. So there was definitely some people that weren't too happy about this new art form emerging out of the African American community. But on the other end, people such as Carl Engel, who was the head of the music division at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., he noted that jazz finds its last and supreme glory in the skill for improvisation exhibited by its performers. And he said that good jazz is oftentimes recklessly fantastic and joyously grotesque. So he actually was a huge fan and proponent of the jazz tradition. And also, jazz-esque things were starting to pop up in literature. For example, the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote extensively about the music of jazz and the jazz kind of subculture in his 1923 book, The Tales of the Jazz Age. So there was definitely two sides to this new emerging genre, and it's also important to note what the function of jazz in the 1920s was. So this is kind of is a continuation of what we were talking about last time, where early jazz, and especially the jazz in the 1920s and the Roaring Twenties, it was first and foremost a music that was accompanied dancing, and it was a very lively, energetic music that was meant to put people in motion. So it was a party music, it was a dance music. And recordings issued by the various jazz groups of this period, they would actually write tunes that were labeled with particular jazz or particular dance steps and particular dances that were emerging. One example would be King Oliver's Chattanooga Stomp, which was accompanied to the dance step called the Shimmy One Step. There was Duke Ellington's East St. Louis Toodaloo, which was accompanied by the Foxtrot. There's also probably the most famous example is James P. Johnson's The Charleston, which there was the most famous dance in the 1920s called the Charleston. So there were all these dances that were common during this period that were associated with various songs. And so this jazz music was very inextricably linked to popular dance of the time. The second main function of jazz during the 1920s was to provide entertainment, and oftentimes these early jazz musicians would have some kind of comedic flair or novelty to their show, which would provide good entertainment for the listener, for the person coming to the show. Jazz bands in the 1920s were often very, very visually stimulating, and that was a huge part of their act. Players would throw their hats in the air, and they would throw drumsticks in the air, and strike these funny poses and different things to put on a good show for the people that were watching, that paid to come to the club that this music was being performed at. Theaters during this period also provided a common venue for presenting jazz musicians on bills, as well as with other performers like professional dancers, like tap dancers and things like this, and different sideshow acts. And so the actual presentation of the show was a very, very, very important thing, which was kind of lost over the years, getting into the 1940s when jazz became more of an art music. It became less of a show and this kind of vaudevillian approach to the music. Back in the 20s, the actual performance and show factor was a huge part of the art form. An example of these kind of shows that went on would definitely be Duke Ellington's group, which was one of the most famous and popular jazz bands of the 1920s. They had a routine at a Harlem theater where Bubba Miley, who was the trumpet player in the band, he would be put into this kind of set that resembled a backwoods church, and he was dressed as a preacher to deliver this kind of musical sermon on his trumpet. So it was definitely there was some dramatic stuff happening in these early jazz shows. Another example would be Louis Armstrong. He had another he had a similar preacher's act where he called himself Reverend Satchelmouth. Satchelmouth, which is Satchmo, which is his nickname. He called himself Reverend Satchelmouth, and he would play these shows with Fletcher Henderson's band and different other groups, where he basically dressed up like a preacher, and he was delivering this divine message to the audience in a sense. Another important kind of event that took place in the 1920s with early jazz happened on February 12th, 1924, with Paul Whiteman's orchestra. So Paul Whiteman was a very important band leader during the 1920s, and was a white individual, band leader, arranger, composer. And he put on a concert in New York City's Aeolian Hall that became one of the most famous concerts in the history of jazz up to this point. And this concert was kind of a crystallizing event for the history of jazz, where Paul Whiteman essentially he said he wanted to make this concert an experiment in modern music. So he essentially was trying to take jazz at the time, which was a predominantly African American art form that was performed in little nightclubs and seedy bars and stuff like this, and he was trying to elevate it to the crowd that was used to going to the symphony and going to the opera, mostly an upper class white crowd. He was trying to elevate the art form. And in his words, he actually said he wanted to make a lady out of jazz. He was trying to make it more, more highbrow in a sense. So his concert in Aeolian Hall in 1924 was this kind of attempt at experimenting with modern music and trying to elevate jazz to the same level of as Western classical music in a sense. And this concert is famous in that he commissioned the young composer George Gershwin to write a piece called Rhapsody in Blue, which was a kind of fusion of Western classical music and jazz of the 1920s. And this piece became incredibly famous and incredibly popular, and sold tens of thousands of copies in the sheet music and in recordings, and became actually one of the most famous pieces in American music repertoire, not only in the jazz tradition, but also in the Western classical tradition. And George Gershwin, he was a young concert pianist and young composer at the time, and really hadn't made a name for himself yet. But this concert, the Aeolian Hall concert in 1924, kind of put him on the map and let everyone know, his genius. And propelled him to fame, and it's an interesting story that kind of goes into this piece, Rhapsody in Blue. He actually co-wrote the piece with a friend of his who was an arranger named Freddie Grofé, who essentially Grofé would go over to Gershwin's apartment in Manhattan, and they would hang out, and Grofé's job was to orchestrate the piece, because Gershwin at this time was a young composer and didn't really know about orchestral orchestration, and he didn't know about how to write a piece for a large ensemble yet. He was just writing piano music essentially. So he would write these little themes, and Grofé would hear it, write it down, write the music down, and then orchestrate it for the large ensemble, the strings and big band that was Paul Whiteman's group, right? And so they were hanging out for a long period, and they collaborated on this piece called Rhapsody in Blue. And at the time, they had no idea that it was going to, be such an influential piece of music, and it was going to be, one of the most important compositions in American music history. And after they performed the piece, and it got huge accolades and wide critical acclaim, they actually, Freddie Grofé and George Gershwin got into a legal battle on who owned the rights to the piece, because Gershwin composed the tune, but Grofé orchestrated it and kind of helped arrange it. So they got into this legal battle, which kind of put a huge strain on their relationship, their friendship. and Gershwin ended up winning the battle and owns the rights to the tune. But during that period, it's important to note that George Gershwin started to make a name for himself in this neighborhood of New York City called Tin Pan Alley. And so Tin Pan Alley, this is an important kind of piece of history as well. This is a neighborhood in Manhattan where all the music publishers were housed. All the companies were in this little neighborhood in Manhattan, and all the songwriters and music and composers would go there to pitch their compositions to the music publishers. And if the publishers liked them, they would record the pieces and write them out and publish the sheet music, and that was like a huge industry. And hundreds of these songs that were published from the Tin Pan Alley producers became known as what we call the Great American Songbook. And these compositions were used, not only as just popular tunes that were played on the radio and performed live, but they ended up going into TV shows and movies and radio shows, or later TV shows, but movies and radio shows, and also Broadway musicals and things like this. So, this is where, American popular music really started. This idea of Tin Pan Alley. And it actually was on West 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue in Manhattan. So it was just a very small little piece of land, but this is where all the real kind of magic happened for American songwriters and American composers. And among the composers that frequented Tin Pan Alley to publish their music, George Gershwin was obviously a huge one. His brother Ira Gershwin also wrote a lot of famous songs and was mostly known as a lyricist. He wrote lyrics. But other composers such as Irving Berlin was published there, Harold Arlen, Hoagy Carmichael, Scott Joplin, James P. Johnson, Cole Porter, Johnny Mercer. So all these big names in American popular music, they kind of made their way into the entertainment industry through Tin Pan Alley. To switch gears a little bit, I want to talk about Louis Armstrong now for a second. Louis Armstrong actually started to rise to fame in the 1920s, and this is when he first started recording. As I said last time, he was from New Orleans, and he, in the early 20s, he made his way to, or early to mid 20s, he made his way up to Chicago to play in King Oliver's band. So King Oliver had an opening for a second trumpet player in his group and invited him up because they were good buddies. So Armstrong made his way up to Chicago, and that's when he really started to come into his own and started to perform regularly and really started to record. And his recording of the West End Blues in 1928 in Chicago really put him on the map, and this is one of the recordings I want you guys to listen to for this week. It's one of the quintessential recordings of the 1920s and really personifies, Louis Armstrong's sound during this period and how important he was. Because if you look at this song, the beginning starts out with Louis Armstrong playing this elaborate trumpet cadenza, and he's essentially showing off his virtuosity on the instrument. And his amazing time feel and rhythmic feel. It's really important also to note that his sense of swing, this kind of rhythmic lilt to his playing, which makes the music feel good, was uniquely his own. He is known in history to have taught musicians how to swing, like what it really means to swing. And this was incredibly influential to the history of jazz and changed the face of jazz music. So any person that heard Louis Armstrong was immediately influenced by him and wanted to sound like him on whatever instrument they were playing, whether they're playing piano or saxophone or drums or what have you. His rhythmic feel and his approach to improvisation was completely unique and heavily influenced every musician that came after. Another famous recording of his during this period was his recording of Lazy River, which he recorded in 1931. This is one of my personal favorites that I want you guys to check out. And this showcases not only Louis Armstrong's incredible, improvising ability on the trumpet and phrasing and melodic choice, but also his very unique vocal style, which he was known for. He also, during this period, he started to do this thing called scat, which is to improvise using nonsensical syllables. That he was the first person to do this, and that heavily influenced every jazz singer that came after him as well, and also his contemporaries through this period. All the jazz singers that were around during this period, everyone was learning from him. He was like this musical sage that just brought about this new genre, this new style of music, this new approach to playing jazz. Jazz had been around for a while up until this point, but he kind of changed the way musicians approached performing and approached improvising. Another interesting story about how Louis Armstrong kind of rose to fame during this period. He started recording in the mid to late 20s with King Oliver in Chicago and in northern Indiana, in Richmond, Indiana. But at a certain point in the late 20s, he got a job offer to start playing with Fletcher Henderson's band in New York City. At this period, during this period, Fletcher Henderson had the most popular and most famous big band, jazz band in New York City at the time. Like, everyone wanted to play with Fletcher Henderson. Everyone wanted to hire Fletcher Henderson because he had the tightest sounding band and the best sounding players. And Fletcher had heard of Louis Armstrong and his playing, and had heard his recordings with King Oliver, and really wanted Armstrong to come to New York to play with him. So we sent a letter to him and asked him if he wanted to move to New York to start playing in his band, and Louis Armstrong just had to take the offer. So the most famous band leader of the period offers you a job, you have to take it. So he got in his car with a couple of his good buddies and his bandmates, and he drove to New York. And actually, he was getting out. By doing that, he was violating his contract that he had with the Chicago Mafia, who ran the alcohol trade and all the speakeasies and whatnot. So he was employed by the Mafia because they were giving him gigs and fronting him money for recordings and things like this. And so he basically made these gangsters pretty angry by leaving Chicago, and so he went to New York, and he actually had a hit out on him. So these Chicago gangsters wanted to kill him during this period. But when he got to New York, he found another manager who would help get him gigs and manage his finances and things like this. And this new manager was actually involved in the New York City Mafia. And so the New York Mafia actually paid off his former employer in Chicago. So they told the hitmen to not kill him after all. But some crazy happenings when you're involved with organized crime, and this is what Louis Armstrong was involved with during this period. Because, as I said, jazz musicians were deeply involved with these criminals, because they performed at the speakeasies and these illicit nightclubs. Another famous performer that was making a name for himself in the 1920s in New York was a pianist named James P. Johnson. This was an individual who was instrumental in inventing this style of music called stride, or this kind of subgenre of jazz called stride, which was basically it was an evolved version of ragtime. The piano style of music, ragtime, that we talked about. Stride was kind of was an offshoot of this. It was a solo piano style that was highly virtuosic and utilized the left hand predominantly. But basically, these stride pianists, they took the role of the bass player and the horn player and the rhythm player all in one. And they would play this solo piano style to accompany dancers at parties and different things. And this arose in Harlem during the 1920s, and James P. Johnson was one of the first practitioners and one of the the pioneers of this early piano style called Harlem Stride. And the tune that I'll have you guys listen to of James P. Johnson's is the Charleston. It was a composition of his that became hugely famous, and people invented a dance to accompany it. That's how popular it was. And so the Charleston, this tune that was written by James P. Johnson, became kind of the theme song of the Roaring Twenties. So it was definitely quite quite important for the evolution of jazz. And actually, stride is still being performed to this day. I myself am a jazz pianist, and I am well versed in this style as well. And so every major pianist, working today in the jazz tradition, knows stride, knows ragtime, and the like. But the Charleston, which I'll have you guys listen to, is a quintessential example of Harlem Stride and what this early music sounded like. Another example of this Harlem Stride style is a composition by James Pease called "You've Got to Be Modernistic." This is another solo piano composition, which is, you can notice that it's a highly virtuosic piece of music. I mean, all these stride performances are very, very virtuosic. You have to be performing at a very high level on the piano to be able to execute this sort of thing. But it emphasizes the left hand, and it's a very, very up tempo and very lively tune. And You've Got to Be Modernistic. This one was recorded in 1930 in New York City. Another one of the great practitioners of the Harlem Stride style was a pianist named Willie the Lion Smith. He was good friends with James P. Johnson and worked with James P. And Willie the Lion Smith was also from New York, just like James P. Johnson. And what's interesting about Willie the Lion is that he had actually fought in World War I in France, and that's where he got his nickname, the Lion. He was reported to be incredibly brave in battle as a artillery gunner, and he was dealing with these gigantic guns, and he exhibited some incredible bravery in battle, and that's where he got his nickname, the Lion. And he actually was part of the 350th Field Artillery Regiment of the Buffalo Soldiers, the famous all African American artillery unit in World War I. So that was Willie the Lion, and so he brought this kind of energy to his playing, and one of the great pianists of American music history, without a doubt. The piece of his that I want you guys to check out is a composition called Morning Air, and this is a great example of the Harlem Stride style and kind of Willie the Lion's approach to stride. He sounds a lot different than other pianists of the period. Also, what's interesting about him is he wasn't really a composer as such. He was more of a performer. He didn't write that many songs over the course of his career, but Morning Air is one of the few that he actually did write. And this particular recording that I want you guys to check out, which you can find on Blackboard, was recorded in 1939. And he was also heavily influential on guys like Duke Ellington, one of the great composers of history, who we'll talk more about in a second. But Duke Ellington actually said that Willie the Lion was the greatest influence of all great jazz piano players that have come along by that time. And according to Ellington, Willie the Lion Smith was at the very top and was incredibly influential to his upbringing as a musician. A third stride pianist that is definitely worthy of mention is a gentleman named Fats Waller, probably the most kind of flamboyant of all the stride practitioners. Fats Waller was, a jazz pianist, composer, singer, and comedic entertainer. He was definitely known for his comedic flair in his performances. And his innovations in the Harlem Stride style actually laid the groundwork for what we now know as modern jazz piano. He was an incredibly influential pianist. The recording of his that I want you guys to check out is a recording called Dinah. It's a composition, not of his. It was actually originally written by Harry Angst in 1925, but it was performed and recorded by Fats Waller several times, and it's one of the great recordings of this period. And what I want you guys to notice about this recording is not only Fats Waller's playing on the piano, but he also sings. And he has a very, very unique style of singing, and he kind of puts this kind of comedic effect into the music, which enhanced the performance. And as I said before, during this period, the performance was key. You had to entertain the crowd. That was priority number one. And then lastly, I wanted to tell you about another pianist, Duke Ellington. Now, this guy was definitely one of the most influential figures in the history of jazz. Definitely one of the best composers of all time, in American music history in general. Duke Ellington, his real name, his given name was Edward Kennedy Ellington, and he went by the Duke. It was a nickname that his friends gave him at an early age because he would always dress very, very elegantly, and he always had this kind of regal royal flair to himself. He had this kind of personality, and he started his own band in the 1920s. First, they were called the Ellingtonians, and then or the Washingtonians rather, because he was from Washington D.C. And he moved to New York, so they're called the Washingtonians. And then he changed the name of this group to the Duke Ellington Jazz Orchestra. And he led the same group for 51 years, one of the longest lasting jazz bands in American history. It's just incredible how he was able to keep his band together for that long and touring for 51 years. It's just quite incredible. And throughout his career, he earned 14 Grammy Awards and also was inducted to the Grammy Hall of Fame. In 1966, President Lyndon Baines Johnson presented him with the President's Gold Medal, which is one of the highest honors a civilian can receive. In 1969, he received the Medal of Freedom from Richard Nixon, which is the highest award any civilian can receive. He also received the Pulitzer Prize, the French Legion of Honor in 1973, and I think probably one of my favorite kind of little anecdotes about him is that in 2009, actually, the U.S. Mint issued a quarter for the District of Columbia with his likeness on it. You're an important, influential person when you get your own quarter. So Duke Ellington is that influential and that important of a figure, that in American history, and that he gets his own quarter, right? But as a composer, he was incredibly prolific, and he wrote over 3,000 pieces of music in his lifetime. And actually at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., they have his entire collection, and he has literally tens of thousands of unpublished songs. So he published a little over 3,000, but he has tens of thousands that he never got around to publishing. He was literally writing music all day, every day, his entire career. So incredibly prolific composer. One of the pieces of his that I want you guys to check out is a composition called Black and Tan Fantasy, which features him and his orchestra. And this is a quintessential example of the kind of Roaring Twenties sound of the jazz big band, and it features Bubba Miley on the trumpet and his trombone player Tricky Sam Nanton, who's imitating some horse sounds and the like, kind of in the same style as the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which we talked about last time. But another important thing to notice about Black and Tan Fantasy is at the very end of the recording. I want you to notice how he actually quotes a theme from the Polish composer Frédéric Chopin. He actually quotes the Chopin funeral march at the end of this recording. So, you know, Duke Ellington was an incredible mind. You know, he wasn't just a jazz composer. He, you know, he was well versed in Western classical music and many different genres, and quite an intellectual person. And that being said, I'll let you guys go with those recordings in mind to focus on for this week. And again, please check out all the recordings that I've mentioned and all the recordings that I have posted on Blackboard for you guys. Also, I want you guys to make sure to keep up on the readings that I've posted on Blackboard as well regarding the 1920s and into the 1930s as well. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.